Hello and welcome to People First, the podcast from the World Bank that brings you stories and voices from Western and Central Africa.
A podcast where we discuss big ideas for transforming African economies in the 21st century.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Inclusive Finance Frontiers.
This is getting settled for new hires.
Welcome to Afronomics.
Today, we're tackling a crucial issue.
What's causing learning poverty? Why have countries found it so difficult to improve learning for children?
Over 220 million people face frequent power cuts or have no electricity at all.
There are real families and communities who are the least equipped to respond to climate change. How are communities on the front lines with limited access to resources adapting?
Welcome to
What
Have We Learned?
The Evaluation Podcast.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Bienvenue dans le podcast People First.
I'm your host, Lamise Daoud.
Je suis Rama George.
I'm your host, Andrew Dabalen.
Timothy Johnston.
I'm Estelle Raimondo,
Rama George.
and I will be your host today.
Hello and welcome.
Welcome.
Bienvenue.
Good day.
Welcome.
Welcome to this episode.
Welcome.
Thank you so much for listening.
Welcome to the podcast.
And that was just a sneak peek of how well produced these podcasts really are and how beautiful the stories are. And you heard a little bit from Rama and Lamise doing their intros in this trailer. So I really do encourage you to check out the podcast because they're very impressive. I've listened to a lot of my life, and it's not just people talking on a microphone. They're producing shows, and they're producing content that really draws on the heartstrings and really engages us in so many ways, with like the nat sounds coming in and out and integrating music throughout the podcast, integrating different voices, on location, both and in the studio as well. It is a big production, and you'll definitely gain a new appreciation for audio content after listening to this panel and taking a listen to some of these podcasts that are being produced and that are represented here on stage. So with that being said, I want to do some more formal introductions of our lovely panelists here. We have Rama George, who leads multimedia efforts for Western and Central Africa. She is the host of the People First podcast, and it features voices, programs, and initiatives supported by the World Bank in their region. It's originally produced in French, but because of the astounding support for the podcast, it now has an English version that she also hosts, and they just kicked off their first episode called Mission 300. In January. So now it is accessible for more people now. She also co-launched the Taste of Change series on Instagram, showcasing Africa's indigenous and sustainable food solutions and supporting efforts to promote climate-smart agriculture. As a seasoned communications expert, Rama has worked for years in the people vertical and in many other units before joining the Africa region. Welcome, Rama. And next we have Lamise Daoud, who is with External Affairs for CGAP, and she's the host of Inclusive Finance Frontiers podcast. Lamise is part of the communications team at CGAP, which is a global partnership of more than 35 leading development organizations housed at the World Bank. CGAP operates as an action-oriented think tank that works to advance the lives of people living in poverty, and especially women, through financial inclusion. Their team is always looking at what are the new challenges and opportunities, then developing and testing solutions that others, including the World Bank, can take forward and implement at scale. Welcome, Lamise. And next we have my colleague, Samantha Mahortha. She's the video and podcast producer at GCS Interactive Media. She's a seasoned storyteller and today's subject matter expert in podcast production. She began her broadcasting career in radio, is a former journalist and television news producer, has worked in the nonprofit space, and has extensive experience in live and taped programming. She works with colleagues here at the bank to bring their stories to life through the power of podcasting and much more. Welcome. So I'd like to begin, if you can go back to, let's start with either Inclusive Finance or the People First podcast slide. We'll have Okay, we'll have Lemis go first. Obviously, podcasting is a powerful and effective tool to reach and engage with diverse audiences and amplify voices from across the region and globally. Can you tell us more about just your podcast at large and what inspired you to create these series?
Hi, everyone. At CGAP, I think it was mentioned earlier, we work at the frontier of the knowledge space of inclusive finance. And so a lot of what we do is looking at, the topics that the new developments in the space, the trends, the controversies. And so in our work, in our everyday work, we come across a lot of stories, a lot of anecdotes that don't necessarily make it into some of our knowledge outputs. But we know there's a lot in there that can be shared. There's a lot of stories that we create with our stakeholders that also have an audience and help reinforce some of our messaging. So the idea came to create a podcast that's like the go-to podcast for the financial inclusion community, where we can touch on all things financial inclusion, a wide range of topics where financial inclusion is part of the conversation or needs to be. And we capitalize on the stories that we come across in the research. So I'm part of the communications team, but we work very closely with the technical team at CGAP from the get-go on their projects. And so we always have an ear to the ground to see where the story is, how best we can tell it, who needs to hear it, what we need them to do, and how best we can package it. And so podcasting seemed like a good way, a good mix to the communication channels and tools that we have at our fingertips.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Rama?
For People First, there was an opportunity for us that we seized right away. Let me give you the context of our region. Western and Central Africa covers 22 countries. And out of those 22 countries, 14 of them are Francophone. So that was one context that we took. But then it's a region where half of the population is young. I mean, the population is young, but it's 6 billion people. And by 30 years from now, that population would double. What does that mean? It means that there will be more people looking for jobs, looking for shelter, looking for food. In addition to that, 30% of our population in Western and Central Africa have access to internet, which means that the majority or the rest of the population relies on radio or on Facebook. So we seize the opportunity of our motto, which is People First, to put people first in our podcast by telling impactful stories, but in a candid way. All our stories have a World Bank angle. They're not necessarily all about the World Bank, but we bring other stakeholders to hear their voices. We take you on journeys throughout different countries, but we could also sit down and have a conversation with people that we would normally not speak with. It's the welder, it's the merchant, but it's also the doctor or the nurse. So that's how People First came about. We started in French because of the number of countries, but then there are also Anglophone countries and Lusophone countries. Hence the idea of launching the podcast in January also in English, so that we can access as many people as possible. We make it jargon-free. Our episodes are short intentionally, so that we can just capture sufficient and share sufficient information with our listeners. After that, once in a while they comment. Sometimes they just like the content, or they say, hey, congrats to somebody who's been featured that they happen to know. So our stories, we try as much as we can to make them relatable to our listeners.
Yeah, I love that. And obviously it like you just said, it empowers us to capture and share insights from people, underrepresented people that might not have had their voices heard otherwise. But it also allows you to access people who might not have been able to access this content otherwise. I shared a post on LinkedIn this morning about this panel happening, and I'm deep in immersive technology and emerging technology myself, but we have to come back to meeting the people at where they are at, right? Where is your audience at, and what are the tools that they have available? And really, podcasting is probably one of the number one tools to get a narrative or a message out that's accessible to the world, because most people already have access to some of these devices. I'd love to touch on maybe just a little bit more about how and why you've chosen podcasting specifically to amplify those voices or to reach those different nuanced audiences, and what the importance of what the strategy was, what the importance of that it really is in your initiatives.
We think there's something really powerful in giving our stakeholders and the people we ultimately are hoping to serve, which in our case are low-income people who are financially underserved and excluded, or who are just starting to access a suite of financial services. So we think it's really important to hear from them, to hear in their voice, from their experiences, what this means for them. We also think, there's a lot of work that happens with our partners, with stakeholders, and a lot of that we might not have all the answers for. We put forth questions, and we think it's with podcasting, we have this ability to bring many people to the table and to just have a conversation and to just debate certain matters, to talk about the pros and cons. So I think podcasting does a great job in capturing that nuance and, providing food for thought, whetting people's appetite about a certain topic, particularly because we were talking about, the podcast episodes being short. We know everyone is busy, but they're also trying to stay informed and connected all the time. So giving them these narratives and these messages in a short format, audio format, on demand, that they can access, I think that's what holds a lot of power with podcasting.
And I'll just chime in for context. Lamisa's podcast is 20 minutes per episode, and Rama's runs at about 15 minutes in length. Both of them are like narrative podcasts, scripted, and Lamisa's is more of a documentary. If you turned it into a video podcast, it would straight up just be a documentary.
It really is. Both of them are they're very dynamic, and they're definitely both documentary style podcasts, and it's very, very engaging to listen to. And I do think that length matters as well, to continue to engage people as also. On that note, let's move over to maybe the production aspect of these things, because a lot goes into it. What makes podcasting, what key techniques that help make podcasting more compelling while still delivering meaningful insights? Because you guys are breaking down some complex information sometimes, and your audience is also diverse, from both stakeholders to also the locals in the region. How do you balance that, and what are some of those techniques and strategies that you use?
From the production side, I mean, you're really thinking about it. What kind of format are you going to use? Are you going to just have a host speaking to the audience? Are you going to have a conversation, just, a host speaking with one or two guests in the room? Are you going to do many interviews and then pull it together with a script? There's so many different formats now, and they're all very effective. But I would say the number one thing is let your story guide you, and always serve your audience. Serve your audience first. It's going to be a combination of, what do they already know? What do they think they know? What do they want to know? What should they know that they don't know to ask for, right? It's just always think of your audience first. Here at the World Bank, there's often many cooks in the kitchen, many opinions, and a lot of people are so just experts in the field, and you get into the weeds a little bit, and oftentimes that can help. That can only muddle the message. I think if you just know what your message is and give it to your audience with clarity, it will go so much further than trying to give them so much additional context that is important in the how you get from point A to point B. But the most important thing is, what is the problem and what is the solution? What is that impact that the World Bank is helping, to solve? So it can be done in 15 to 20 minutes.
I'm curious from your end. Yeah.
I definitely echo that, because in our case, considering that we try not to go beyond 15 minutes, we have to be concise, but we also need to speak in a simple and accessible way. No acronyms that somebody outside the bank wouldn't understand or wouldn't relate to. We also try to put ourselves in the position of the listener. Does this make sense to you? Or should I say it differently? Often with Sam, I'm sitting and reading the script, and then I tell her, oh, no, we need to redo this. It doesn't make sense to me. I'm saying it, but I'm not convinced. So when you're podcasting, I think that you need to think about your listener, think about what they may want to know, and try to explain as much as you can without using complicated language. Because at the end of the day, people are busy. They're listening to your podcast, but they're doing a million other things. Before entering into the podcasting world, I never listened to podcasts. But then I was forced to.
You're welcome.
And it's been a beautiful journey.
It's been incredible to see their transformation. Both of these women would come into the studio and they haven't recorded anything. And now they're like, they come in raring to go. Everybody's, amped up.
Well, I'm actually curious more to hear about that in terms of like what the process was like in working together in the beginning, and maybe coaching them a little bit, and what the things that they have to be aware of, and what makes them the great hosts they are today.
I mean, I think it's just comfort. It's a learned skill. Public speaking is a learned skill. Writing for a technical paper is different than writing for broadcast and writing for someone's ears. And so we really just try to break these ideas down. Don't speak in word salad. Oftentimes when you are writing something, it's clear when you're reading it in your head, but not clear when it comes out of your mouth. And so I would encourage people to, if you're writing a script, actually just say it out loud and see how that sounds. And with both of them, we've had experiences where it's just an on-the-fly rewrite of a sentence, a rephrasing here or there, editing, as we go along and we're recording. And it just makes it better. Just, you're human, your audience is human, and just I always ask, do you talk like that? And if you do, then fine, we can include it. But sometimes they're like, I don't talk like that. And then we change it.
Yeah. And that's a big reason why we've decided to curate the new podcast studio in the way that it is. Can you talk a little bit about why it's set up in that way now versus the conference roundtables that we had at first?
So you can record a podcast in any number of ways, right? We can set up microphones at a table, but a lot of people, having never recorded anything in person before, are a bit uncomfortable and a bit closed in, and they like to read things. And podcast is different than a voiceover, right? That's not what we're going for. A podcast, we're talking about conversations, real life conversations. And so what we wanted to do is to facilitate those, not throw away your notes completely. You have them in your head. You are a subject matter expert. You're there for a reason, right? And so we're going to have a couch and chairs and, just make it a place where you just want to sit and engage and talk with someone. And in that way, the listeners can hear. They can hear when you're smiling. I make them record when they're standing up because it sounds different than when you're sitting down. All of these things really make a difference. And even though our audience won't be there in the room with us, the room setup will facilitate a better conversation, which will lead to a better product, guaranteed. Really excited about it.
Limis, I'm curious about what it was like for you during this process, and how do you think this process has influenced your approach to storytelling?
Sure. So I have to say that I was very intimidated to be a podcast host. I was not expecting this role. And thanks to Sam and her coaching, I think we got there towards the end. But if anyone's contemplating starting a podcast and thinking, can I actually do it? With the right coaching, I think you can. So it was definitely a learning curve. It was definitely a lot of just stepping out of the CGAP and World Bank bubble a little bit, because we know with this podcast we're trying to reach audiences beyond. This is not an internal podcast, and we want anyone to be able to access it, listen, be like, oh, this is interesting. Maybe I'll forward it to someone in this space, or maybe I'll look into this a bit more. So we're talking about like a really wide range of audiences. And so, having that in mind and knowing that, we can't, it's not World Bank speak, or it's not just a focus on our messaging. And in our case at CGAP, we also wanted to make sure the story is not us. We're using this podcast, the documentary style, the conversation with others, to spotlight other stories that we come across that are of interest. Sure, we have some findings to share in the space, but we also want to hear from others. What are we missing? What do we need? What also needs to be part of the equation? So it's been an interesting process just to remember the storytelling aspect of it, and not fall back on, thinking about this as an output that we're putting out, like as part of our research and our work.
Wonderful. And so, Sam, we've talked about, I guess, the scripting maybe aspect of it and the presentation aspects of producing a podcast. But from a production perspective, can you tell us what goes into making these stories very immersive via audio? That's not easy to do. and they're beautiful. Like I said, it's not just people speaking on microphones. It is a show that you are listening to, and they're very, very beautiful. So what goes into the production process to achieve this level of professional
I
storytelling?
once took a screenshot of Rama's podcast visually, so even she can get an idea of all the different layers of audio. You have the host narration we record in studio. You have interviews that you have recorded wherever you've recorded them, sometimes in studio, sometimes out in the field. You have layers of nat sound, which is so important. Never underestimate the power of nat sound, natural sound, a bus on the street, people walking. We've done what I would consider highly internal kind of content for Rama's podcast. And I'm like, go into the elevator, press a button, and record the audio of the elevator in the MC building, so we can hear you traveling up the building. It's the audio, those things are going to transport people from wherever they're seated in that moment to wherever you want them to go. It is so powerful and a really inexpensive way to do it. So one fabulous thing is for Rama's podcast, she's got so many different countries she's working with, and we compiled these audio kits with Zoom mics, and we dispatched them to country offices all over the place so that they can go, and we're doing an episode and there's an electric bus fleet that's brand new. Now you can hear someone get onto that electric bus and say hello to the bus driver. And that is different than, I'm reading a paper about it. I'm reading a blog about it. People are transported, and it makes them more connected to the work. And that's what's so powerful about it.
Right. You're not just reading an article that you've written and published somewhere else. It's a completely new format of a way.
Lives that are changed. Did an episode about energy, and we're talking about a town that now has 24-hour access to electrical power. I mean, that's really transformative.
Yeah, kudos to my communication colleagues in the country offices. They are really the stars behind this podcast because without them, we wouldn't have this content. They're the ones who go and find the talent, if I may say, the voices, the guests, interviewing them. And now we have even managed to go beyond the actual audio. We have the interview. So for any content, since our podcast is about 15 minutes long, for any content that we don't share, we have the interview. So if you're curious about someone, go and find out. There is the People First podcast, the interview with a special guest. So you get to really know people who are working in the field and how back projects are helping change their lives. Or you have innovators.
Yeah. Yeah. And so bringing it back to accessibility, because we've talked about dissemination of content and representing underserved voices, but accessibility in terms of producing these in the first place is a lot better maybe than some other mediums of communication where you need true professionals there with you. Like you said, you disseminated how many studio kits all over
20 kits
all over the world. Yeah.
3 offices. Yeah, with just it's a Zoom mic. You know, we included the batteries, and you just press record, and then it plugs into the computer, and then you can upload it to SharePoint, and then we already have it here. It's as instantaneous as as your internet connection is, right?
Yeah.
And it's been so powerful. It's probably the least expensive way to have an immersive, really transformative media experience.
Mm-hmm. And then I know when we spoke on our intro call for this, you spoke about how you delivered this content through, or these links through mediums like WhatsApp, right? Because a lot of people have access to these platforms in those regions. So can you talk a little bit about how accessibility in terms of how you're just disseminating this information in these links that are maybe a little bit different than other forms of communication and media?
Sure. Whenever we release an episode, we promote it through social media, mostly on Facebook and also on X, sometimes on LinkedIn. But we have discovered that the most effective way for our stories to be heard is through WhatsApp. So we share it internally among colleagues, and then we encourage them to share the stories using WhatsApp. Just press a button, you have a group of friends, you tell them about the story, and that has helped tremendously our audience and our reach. Trying to venture into radio, local radio, but we're just starting. It's not as easy as one would think.
But you can just potentially even repurpose some of this content for radio as well, right? Because it's already produced. Lamis, I'd love to hear if podcasting has helped overcome some communications challenges that you've had with other mediums, and what makes this more of an effective medium for communication.
I think podcasting is, as I said before, it's really important to be part of the communications mix of tools and tactics, because there's an extra something with podcasting that we don't necessarily get to do with other outputs. And I would just go back to the point about, with our podcasts, we're also trying to move away from the us story. So I think that's what gives it, that's what makes it a little different to the other tools and outputs that we put out there. So what our approach to the podcast is, we come across a story, we come across anecdotes, we come across an angle. Sometimes we're doing a bit of work there, sometimes not so much, but we're trying to continue to be at the frontier of the knowledge space within financial inclusion, and that is our aim. And so it gives us that ability to go beyond the day-to-day, where the comms team is obviously working with the research teams to produce knowledge products, reports, social media content, but to build stories together with our partners and with our stakeholders. So I think that's what makes it quite special for us.
Also, can I, unrelated, you can not every podcast has to be this really formal affair with a host and a script and all of these, like special interviews that are all over the world and take so much time and effort. This event is being recorded and I'm going to turn it into a podcast. Okay. And we're going to edit it down and people can reference it later for if you have a colleague that you think might be interested in, all of these things. You can just start where you are with events that you're already doing, with content that you already have. Rama's she's sending in, she's incorporating sound bites and of things that they've had in the repertoire of their library, of things that have not been used before, finding topics, inspiration, stories there, and then we're turning it into something else. So it can be, and never underestimate the power of pre-production, right? And I would say let the stories guide you. It can be this big thing, and it also doesn't have to be. It can just be people having a conversation, you record it, but please have good audio quality, okay? You can't make a gourmet meal out of ingredients that aren't already great. But you can make a podcast out of lots of different things.
Yeah, and it doesn't need to be super expensive with heavy equipment and all of these things. There's so many tools now available for anyone to get involved in something like this, and start producing content. Sam and I actually went to a conference recently called the Podcast Movement Conference, and experienced some pretty awesome developments in the podcasting world. And every major brand has a podcast now. And they've done lots of different things revolving different types of content, video content, dissemination things. Some of them have multiple channels for podcasts that are specific on very unique topics. And as you heard, Sam, we're turning this event into a podcast itself. So there's lots of new trends and evolution in the podcasting world. I almost feel like it's kind of making this comeback again because there's so much, everything's so busy. There's so much advertisements being fed to you. There's so much email coming to you and things like that. So when you are, and now everybody's commuting in the car, listening to audiobooks and all of those things, and just podcasts are a big, they're always been a big thing, but there's a lot of evolution in the industry. So if you would like to talk about maybe some of the futurist type of visions of some of the things that we saw at the conference and some of the things that we're doing.
Video podcasts are really, really big, are only going to get bigger. Even if it's two people having a conversation, a host and a guest, people just are interested in who you are and seeing the faces, who's speaking, what are your facial reactions, what is this actual conversation? Google is the number one search engine. YouTube is the second, right? And so I think all of these they're tools. You can have an audio podcast and that is perfect and fine. But video podcasts are really where everything is trending. I mean, you're on Instagram. It used to just be photos and now it is not anymore, right? Podcasts weren't a thing, really when I started my career. And now look, in a few years, it's going to be something new. So we just kind of follow the trends. I think we are trying to integrate the video podcasting as a capability in our, new studio. I think in the next fiscal year, we'll be there. But I think just have good audio. If you can swing it, have good video, but you could take 4K video on your phone now, have a steady shot with a tripod. So just capture the content and capture a good story and a good conversation, and then we can turn it into something great.
Yeah, I mean, we always say if you're going to do this anyways, then there's so many different ways to capture this content via events, live events, via video, and then audio as well. And then you have more options to publish this on various platforms where you're going to reach a more diverse audience. And so just depending on what the communications goals are, as I'm sure you all are aware of, these are the decisions that are made based on those things. So like it just makes your targeting stronger, I guess, depending on what you're going for there. So I would love to know, you ladies are starting on I know Lamis is starting on her second season, right? And then you've started your English versions of your podcast. So it seems apparent that you've had some great feedback on these series that you've published. So I'd love to hear from your perspective, from some of the listeners or stakeholders, what's some of the feedback that you've heard.
Well, in terms of feedback, there is a story that we ran exactly a year ago for Women's Month. And it was about the Sahel Women Empowerment and Demographic Dividend Project, the SWED and the SWED Plus. And we're lucky to get a lot of materials from my own home country, from Mali. So we decided to feature 4 women from different walks of life who benefited from the SWED project. One became a painter, one became a restaurateur or caterer, another one a mechanic, and then this lady, a photographer. What they had in common is that they took the training, the SWED training, they heard about it on radio. And for this woman, Fatmata Konate, she said that her grandmother heard about the SWED program on radio and she encouraged her to go because she had dropped out of high school and she had odd jobs. She was selling clothes at the market. So I found that her story was heartwarming because she's so grateful for the impact that this project had on her life. So we decided when we published the story to feature a little bit about her. And she's not tagged because we don't know her. And I guess somebody found out and told her that she was being featured in a World Bank podcast. And there she goes, thanking the World Bank and the partner agency and other NGOs, saying that she's very proud. And she sends us her blessings for having done such a good job and for having changed her life. A little epilogue to her story is that she went from beneficiary of a bank project to becoming a contractor now for the SWED Mali. So she covers events for them. To me, that was the best feedback that we could get out of our path.
That's a great story. Well, that concludes today's event. we are taking
Any questions?
questions from the audience, both in teams. There's some questions in teams as well from the live stream. So if you want to,
Yes.
And Jim-
So we have 2 questions coming at you. What metrics do you look at when measuring the success of the podcast? What is the listening medium rate? And the second question for now is, I would love to hear ideas on how to market a World Bank podcast.
I mean, for us, in terms of measuring the success of a podcast, we haven't been adopting one particular way. So we believe that we need to look at different aspects to tell the whole story. So obviously, we look at the data, the analytics. We take into consideration the feedback, the impact, as Rama was just describing. So we take all of that together, and we also look at other podcasts in the space, and I think one thing also that might be worth keeping in mind is the time frame. Like we've noticed from some of our blogs and now some of our podcast episodes, our older versions, they have quite a long shelf life. So it would be a little unfair for us when we're looking at when we're measuring success to not factor that in and to make sure that we continue to monitor over a long period of time before making a judgment. So, for example, we published 2 pilot episodes back in 2018 or 2019, and they keep getting more listens, like by the dozens, without us even promoting, like on a month. I shouldn't say that, I'll get back to the numbers, but there's quite a big listenership for them still. So I think that's something to keep in mind.
I think it's exactly the same for us. The longer the podcast has been out, the more we're able to tell whether it has been successful or not. But there are some cases whereby we take advantage of an event or an application process, such as for the Young Professional Program. We released a podcast in French just before the application process closed, and we worked closely with the HR team. That was one of our most successful podcast episodes because you had so many people, I guess, who were interested in the program, who wanted to know more about the program in French. And we brought different people who had gone through the Young Professional Program, from somebody who was just starting, for somebody who was finishing, from somebody who now works in a country office and who has been through it several years ago, to a director who reflects on her 20 years. So it really depends.
Yeah. I would add, I mean, piggybacking off exactly what you said, we've had partners that have come to us saying, oh, we want to produce one podcast and see how it goes, and then we'll decide if we want to do more. But it doesn't work that way, right? Just like anything with marketing, it needs to be consistent. And that's one thing I would also say is consistency, not just longevity of a podcast series, but if you're saying you're going to post every month on a Monday, on the first Monday, you're going to do that every month on that Monday. Because of just SEO in general and the way that the way that the spiders on the web track you, but also like your listeners are expecting that to be put out on those dates. Another thing that I would say is, this isn't a panel for me, but I have to say, sorry. Another thing I would say is if you're producing especially long form content, to cut up the content into shorter pieces that can extend the life of that one piece of content. And then you can draw listeners back in to engage with that longer form content. That's going to also continue to create longevity for that piece of content as well, especially if you're on social media and stuff like that. And you're not just posting once, you're posting 2 or 3 times about that piece of content and re-engaging listeners in different ways. So, yes.
Hi, this is Anaí Rama from WFA, Finance and Accounting. I have a very specific question. I've been thinking about producing a podcast, but every time I think about it, I think about how long it takes to produce a 15 minutes podcast and how much it costs. Thank you.
It depends. Everything depends. What style of podcast, what format, your topic, everything, it depends. I would say the length of your podcast should swing between 15 and 20 minutes or so, at least for a World Bank audience, is a really good kind of a sweet spot, 20 minutes. And the production will depend on the style and the format of your podcast. It's very easy and you can do a quick turnaround if it's 2 people, having a conversation in a room. We can just get you the transcript and you red line out the content that you don't want. And then we just kind of produce it right there. And that's a lot easier. If you're doing, something much more involved with many layers and nat sound and going out in the field and getting interviews and all of that stuff, of course, it takes a lot longer. So with everything, it depends.
So when you go and listen to the People First podcast and Inclusive Finance podcasts, those are like top of the line productions. But then they're all top of the line. But like Sam was saying, it depends on whether you're incorporating all of these different pieces and piecemealing it together to have this dramatic series, or if you're just doing straight talk from start to finish, and then you have bumpers, intro, outro bumpers at the end. That's very easy, very doable, quick turn, and it costs a lot less. And I can talk to you about that after.
Hi, all. I just wanted to thank you all for leading this lovely panel. It's been great to hear from more senior producers and to hear about folks who do this really regularly. So I have some previous experience with audio production and podcast production. So I just kind of have 2 specific questions to ask. You mentioned using natural audio. Love it. It's my favorite thing. There are some stock websites with options for if you need a doorbell ringing or an elevator button pressed. Have you guys ever used stock natural audio, if that's an option just for a short thing? And then my second question was regarding remote recording. specifically like the quality of remote recording and other software where it can record to a machine and then upload that to the cloud. But if you're doing a podcast with someone far away, are you sending them equipment for that specifically every time? Yes. Okay. You're not recording on like a machine on a Mac and okay. Understood.
How many people at the World Bank have Macs?
Exactly. Understood. Capiche. Understood. So you're not trusting computer audio, you're sending them a Zoom kit. Understood.
Yeah, not a Zoom kit with some. We did this with Lemise. Basically, it's like I got a guest in England. This is their address, and then we're sending them. Headsets work really well because then a lot of people when they're moving around, then the mic is in front of their face. We'll send, even the IEG podcast. Remote, or we ought to have a host in New York or what have you. Yeah.
Setting radios are really important.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you can't make a video without video. You can't make an audio without audio. I mean, absolutely. So the quality of your microphone will matter, of course. The quality of the equipment will matter. But yeah, lots of people, we record on whatever laptops and strong internet connection. And then we send out equipment. Yeah.
One more question from
And your Nat Sound, yes, I have used those stock things, but not a lot. Yeah, well, there's an example that I think of like we talk about small businesses and like the door opening to your local shop, that little bell on the door, it's easily relatable.
Very good.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
One question from the chat is how AI has influenced workflow and any tools that you have used during the production of this podcast.
Yes. Also part of the trends, right? You can use AI. AI as a tool. I don't use it for creating any content, right? But there are many tools to be used. You're thinking about splicing up your podcast for shorter bits and pieces for social media. There are tools for that. There are things that there's just software out there that can do work that I know for a fact that humans cannot do. We get a lot of pre-produced media that people just want. It's like, I use the analogy, it's like a baked lasagna, but they're like, here, I can't unseparate it back into I can't unbake it, all the ingredients are there in this video. And now I can separate that music from that audio, from the interview. And it is incredible. It is jaw-dropping from a production standpoint. And so I can use it. I can splice up that audio feed, zhuzh it up, and then place it seamlessly into a podcast for an interview. I mean, it's really incredible. So use them as tools, use them to help you. And I would caution anyone on going too far too fast and using it to create your
Take the AI compliance training when you get a chance before you go to authority.
the journalists.
And also, I believe like at the bank, you especially just need to be more careful because you are supposed to be representing these regions and these initiatives as they are, right? And so you just have to be extra careful. But in workflows, there's so many awesome ways to use AI. But just remember, you need to know what you want out of it, and you need to be somewhat of a subject matter expert in what the output is. So you're just not blindly trusting, what AI is giving you. But that's a general scale. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Lindy. I work at the IFC as a lead audio producer. We have a couple of podcasts too, so please check them out at ifc.org. Just a quick question on language. One of our podcasts is Creative Development with IFC. That's hosted by our MD, Magda Diop, who does speak French. So every now and then we do a French episode. But we find that in general, when it comes to the audio side of things, engagement drops. Every time we do an episode in French, it picks up on video because that's also a video podcast. So that medium seems to reach more people, French-speaking audiences. But certainly when it comes to audio, it drops. So I was curious about the decision to adopt 2 languages for a podcast and how that helps you. I mean, how do you maintain your following or your subscribers? And do you re-record an episode in French? So it's 1 episode in 2 languages, or curious about that.
No, for People First, we do 1 episode where we started doing some episodes. The narration is in French, and then we have guests who speak other languages, so we dub them. but it's not an ideal, although it brings the local flavor, if I may call it that way, by having native language spoken. When we decided to have an English version, Sam and I figured that if we can avoid dubbing anybody, unless it is somebody in the region and we really want to include them in the episode, we would try as much as possible to have the episode just in English. So this year, when we launched the first one on Mission 300, it was a simple format, a sit-down interview with our regional director for infrastructure to explain Mission 300, what it is all about. But then in the subsequent episode, in February, in French, we just decided to go on the road. So we take people to Cameroon in French, to Burkina Faso in French, and then the streets of Abidjan, all in French.
Yeah. And in terms of, if you can go back one slide, Casey. Can you go back one slide? And we just have to show this because there's a couple slides that Rama shared with us, but I mean, they're getting 10,000 engagements on some of their posts on their podcast, which is reflective of the popularity of their series. Thank you so much, ladies, for joining us. Thank you for all of your hard work in helping to give voices to your local communities and these important initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.